welcome to the Anxious in Austin podcast.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks for listening to us / watching us.
Yes, thanks for showing up. I am Dr. Marianne Stout with the Anxiety Treatment Center of Austin.
Yeah, and I'm Dr. Thomas Smithyman.
And
myself, yes.
Of yourself, formerly of the Anxiety Treatment Center of Austin.
Yes.
And we were trying to brainstorm and sift through all of the fan mail and decide
which of those topics should we talk about from all those requests.
And you had the brilliant idea of kind of circling back and doing something that a fresh take on something that is a classic for us, doing exposure, like our thoughts.
I mean, I was thinking I remember we did really early on.
Yeah.
We did one on like cognitive interventions, but I couldn't remember us doing one on like basic exposure, right?
We've never done an exposure.
We've never done exposure. That's what I thought. I think because we brought it up a few times.
We talk about exposure in every single podcast.
Well, we kind of have to, right? But we've never done one that's directly on it. I think maybe because it seemed too basic, and we wanted to do kind of more novel, interesting things for us. But that's why I'm like, yeah, probably. I believe 3 years in, it is time for us to do one on exposure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I did zero research for this one, but
I feel like maybe historically you've done some research.
Because it's like such
you know some stuff about exposure.
But yeah, because this is like so much of our every single day lives. Like I think about exposure every single day.
Yeah.
So exposure. I wish I had my little handout I give to clients.
Yeah. Well, walk us through your handout. Since people listening on the podcast, the handout wouldn't help them anyway. So
yeah. I have to like think back. So it talks about like how exposure is basically thinking in like learning theory terms. It's wanting an extinction of a response. And so like the basic premise is of working fears, or what we call like leaning into anxiety. It's used for anxiety, phobias, PTSD, OCD, GAD.
Let's not forget social anxiety.
Social anxiety. Kind of like see the handout.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it talks about it as though like there's a learned thing that you're afraid of. Like it gives the example, if you get in a car accident, you like learn to be afraid of something, which is all well and good. But some of the things it's not that clean, right? Like
you can't point to, oh, here's where I learned to be afraid of this thing.
Yes, or like a panic attack often is just like scary in and of itself.
Yeah.
I guess you learned to be afraid of the panic attack after having a first panic attack, but and like OCD, right? Like there's like intrusive thoughts, and so it's not like you necessarily were in a situation and you learned to be afraid of it. But anywho, it talks about like, okay, you could take like memory, for example. Say you got in a car accident, you learned to be afraid, and you associated then driving with this feared outcome. So exposure would mean starting to drive or doing driving related things and having a different response, seeing that it's safe, or at least that even if it's not super safe, it's something you can cope with. And the more that you do these exposures or face it, then you start to kind of crowd out that feared memory of the car accident, and it's easier to all the safer memories that you've created.
Yeah.
And that we often work in like a graded exposure, like doing hierarchies, starting small and working your way up.
Yeah.
That's basically what it says in this handout.
So, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think the kind of important stuff from that, I mean, in my mind, right, you're sort of emotional brain. You have a fear of, if I encounter something, or I go to a certain situation, or I do a certain activity, you have this emotional, feared prediction of something that's going to go terribly wrong. And as a result, of course, you avoid it.
Avoid.
Yeah, you avoid it, you escape, you try to prevent this terrible outcome from happening. And that belief is what kind of keeps the anxiety going. And avoiding and escaping mean that you keep reinforcing, you still believe that this must be dangerous because you keep avoiding it, you haven't seen any alternative. And so I think in nerd terms, I believe inhibitory learning, isn't it? Inhibitory learning theory is this idea of not that it's extinction, right? Because this is maybe getting a little bit nerdy, but it's not that you're extinguishing a belief; it's that you're inhibiting it by building up a new belief. So where the previous belief is feared outcome, like a danger, I have this danger belief. I believe that facing this situation will lead to danger. You face it enough times and have non-danger happen, like if safety occurs, that you then build up an alternative theory that it's actually safe. And you do it enough times, collect enough evidence that alternative theory becomes more convincing over time, emotionally.
Sure. Right? And I think that, the important piece of that too is like the emotional piece of it, because you might know logically, right? Like it's totally safe or it's completely fine. But right, emotional brain is like, show me, and show me a whole bunch of times, because
totally,
that all sounds well and good, but I can't really trust it if I haven't experienced it.
Totally, and and then I think when people often ask well, why am I afraid of this when I know that it is not going to happen? Well, sometimes rational brain, you don't really know what's going to happen because you've avoided it so much, but even if you know it's not actually dangerous, still the emotional part of the brain, a different part of the brain is the part that is seeing the danger and seeing the threat, and it has this underlying fear, right? So one of the first things we do when we're looking at exposures, already when we're treating anxiety at all, right, is we're trying to identify what is the feared outcome.
To turn this on a bit.
Yeah. So
right, I always think of this like working on externalizing the thought, because when it is just in your emotional brain, right, it's hard to articulate, it's hard to have perspective and see it for what it is, and that work and starting to externalize it, right, doesn't make it so all of a sudden oh, I'm not scared of this anymore, but it starts getting that more rational brain online, and you start to get a little perspective, and people often say to me I know this sounds crazy, or I know this sounds silly, but this is what I'm afraid of, and I always think of
totally.
Until we did that, until we started to identify it and externalize it did not sound crazy or silly. It just felt true.
It felt, and I think that's the key, right? You feel this fear, and that's why I think identifying that exact feared outcome, it's taking it from this blurry feeling of fear, and I should just, I need to escape, I'll just get away from it. But when you actually have to translate it into English, in our cases, you translate it into English, then it's well, I guess what I'm afraid of happening is this thing. Yeah, and they have that doesn't really sound right, but that's still what the emotional brain is predicting. And once we have that prediction, then we can start to figure out, well, what exposures could we do that are testing out that negative expectancy, that feared outcome.
Okay, this thought just came to me, but it's kind of like in campy horror movies, right? When you don't see, or in Jaws, when you didn't see the shark, it's way scarier than when you actually identify what the threat is. When you see the shark, I mean, it's still scary and everything, but it's also oh, that's not a real shark, or that's just a person, or that's a person in a mask. Or, I mean, you're still afraid, right? You still have
or when you see the aliens in
exactly.
I know there's actually something that is in that kind of movie. It's actually in movie theory for that kind of movie is how long can you go without actually showing you the creature, because you're right, it starts to kill the
Yeah.
effect once you actually see it,
See
because
it.
the unknown version of it is actually harder than when you've identified it.
Yes. Like, do you
Yeah,
watch Stranger Things?
I haven't watched that.
Well, this I'm
Are you hang on, let's pause here. Are you about to do some sort of spoiler for me and everybody else who's listening? Note to audience. I've asked Marianne to
Okay.
wear a spoiler alert T-shirt whenever she talks
Fine.
about anything.
Fine. I won't. Never mind. Let's pick a different
Okay.
topic. It's
So,
not a spoiler, but it probably is a little bit of a spoiler.
okay. Yeah. Things that you think are
I'm just
not
gonna say,
spoilers are spoilers.
seeing
Yes.
a monster is less scary than not seeing it.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. And so for us, yeah, that process of identifying it alone drops anxiety. You can say, well, what I'm exactly afraid of is that I'm going to go into the situation, this will go wrong, and people will respond in this way, or whatever it is. Identifying the exact details, yeah, that robs it of some anxiety, and that gives us our path to how we're going to do an exposure
Mm-hmm.
to basically to test it out, because we
Yeah.
really want to find that the outcome is different than the feared
Expectation.
predictions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we also know that it's just inevitably going to be that it's just because our brains are built that way. We're built to overestimate and
Anxiety is a terrible
catastrophize.
predictor of outcomes, and even when it does, like something bad happens, it's never the way that anxiety predicted it would be.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this does open up for me though. The and I kind of want to hear your take on this, but like when we start to talk about it this way, as in like fear prediction versus like what's the outcome that we see, that to me, we start to move from exposure quotation to behavioral experiments.
I mean, I feel like exposure is more. I mean, they're pretty much the same, except for I feel like behavioral experiments is explicitly stating the cognitive piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just feel like at least the way that I do it, I am always gonna, when I'm doing an exposure, I'm always gonna be having some cognitive pre and cognitive posts. Like I'm gonna in advance.
So when we talk about exposure, we are always just meaning ways of leaning into the fear, ways of
facing the fear directly.
Anxiety.
And
what he's saying with what you're saying with behavioral experiment is really kind of being very explicit as to like, getting this part involved of like what is anxiety predicting the outcome will be, what's an alternative, less believed possibility, what are kind of ways and steps you could take to explicitly face it, and what is the outcome, to kind of really get this so much involved of like seeing that pre and post piece.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. It's like exposures just all the time. Face it, lean into it. It's not always as like.
Well, I just think of it as it's more like
what their beliefs are.
Sure. Yeah, it's like the framing in my mind, like the framing process of like in any case you are going to move towards something you're afraid of instead of away from it. But in my mind, there's a benefit to explicitly saying you are testing this prediction. This is an experiment. Let's see what happens. Versus kind of that brute force thing of like, just do it 20 times and then it won't bother you as much. Like there's this benefit of like, what is your emotional brain predicting? What's this kind of theory behind this? And then going out and seeing what happens and then saying, well, what does that tell us? What did you learn? How accurate is that thought? And I kind of think of it on the, I'm sure we talked about it a ton of times, but that idea of anxiety overestimates the likelihood that things will go wrong. and then it like basically catastrophizes how bad it would be if it does go wrong. And I feel like when we're doing exposure, right, if we set it up with like, hey, these things pretty much happen all the time with anxiety. We will go test this out. Here's your prediction. Let's find out if it is overestimated, the odds of it going wrong. And if it does go wrong, let's see if it's catastrophic or if it's like tolerable.
Uncomfortable or doable. Yeah.
And I feel like framing beforehand and then especially doing the what did we learn afterwards, I feel like, at least in my style, I feel like that makes it like a deeper, like a sort of a deeper change process.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense.
But I feel like you do that anyway with exposure.
Well, yes, I do a lot of like, yeah, what are you afraid of? Why? What's the feared outcome? Getting really explicit with that. Yeah. Then let's find doable ways of leaning into it, of facing it, of creating exposure. And then afterwards, more of like, what did you notice? What actually happened? Mm-hmm. What did you feel emotionally? What did you feel physically? What kind of thoughts came? Like,
yeah,
what did you notice? So yes, it's probably not as explicit.
Yeah, but it's still doing that same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, because for me, there's always you're doing the exposure, you are facing it, and it is that expectancy difference that we're looking for. But there's always like, the overestimating or catastrophizing bias beforehand. All kinds of lessons that you can learn afterwards because you're actually getting new information from facing something. Yeah, so when I'm doing it, I'm thinking like either that cognitive, like we're testing out on a cognitive level of like, oh, is it overestimating? Is it catastrophizing? And by facing the situation that you haven't faced before, there's all kinds of new information coming in that can tell you oh, I didn't realize this. I wouldn't have expected that. You're actually facing the real thing. So you are getting like really information for the first time. And like some of that is unpredictable. And
sure.
Like I like that.
I just think though, the biggest thing, I think all this cognitive stuff obviously is important, but I think what people are wanting often is that like, right, the feeling, I want this to feel different. And that people experience such a difference in how they feel once they're doing exposure.
Yeah.
They're like, cognitive stuff is like great. But I feel like they want that emotional piece. And maybe like cognitive enhances that or deepens.
Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah. What's the feeling change you're talking about?
I mean, we have talked about this before, obviously, but I mean, so yeah, feelings of like reduced anxiety, but also, right, like that pride piece.
Totally.
Right, of like before being cowering in front of a threat or feeling helpless or hopeless.
Yeah, submissive, dominated. Yeah.
Yes. In doing it and like proud, right? Like this thing that has had so much power over me for so long, like I'm actually able to face it. And yeah, a lot of people describe like maybe not right away, but like a more like sense of calm, like that I have more confidence in being able to do things. So it feels less overall, right? Anxious. Yeah. And like there are these things that I haven't been doing in so long and created such a big emotional response. And now I feel like I have the ability to cope better or to face things more easily.
Yeah, for sure. Which is like a sort of a self-efficacy thing, right? It's like personal power. Like I think that pride, the feeling pride part, like I know we talk about it, but I don't hear people talking about it. But it's what I hear people that we work with talking about.
You mean you don't hear about it in like the literature.
Yeah, I don't see it written about in the studies. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that is a huge piece, right? When you're moving from like, because we always talk about anxiety as a bully, and that piece of like when you're facing a bully, right? And you like conquered it or you didn't let it beat you. Like, yeah, there is this feeling of like pride.
Yeah.
Like, I am tough. I did this thing.
Totally.
That so running from for so long.
Right. That feels, and generally because it has been a long time. And so doing it, man, it feels good. It feels like there's a self-esteem that comes with like, oh, I am acting in accordance with my sort of more
Yes.
my like true self
Yes.
rather than cowering. That feels really, really good. And this is on top of doesn't happen every time, but the habituation kind of idea of like you do exposure enough times and
anxiety up, kind of plateaus, and eventually starts to come
yeah,
down.
yeah, the anxiety itself comes down. And so you can, even though anxiety's with exposure, this is I think something we should mention if they need to know, that we avoid our triggers for anxiety because it feels bad. But in exposure, you are temporarily escalating your own anxiety by facing something, knowing that over the long term, you are most likely going to have less anxiety.
Yes. Either from like direct habituation or from being able to tolerate that, increase your distress tolerance, where like you can tolerate distress way better than you previously could or thought that you were able to.
Totally. Yeah, there's one, I remember telling you about this years ago. I remember there was one paper I read where the person's theory was that basically all exposure was about distress tolerance, implicitly learning that you can handle that feeling of anxiety and those unpleasant feelings. That, I mean, sort of the idea that across the board, people with anxiety disorders are having trouble tolerating the distress. And if you go purposely take it on, like really welcome it in, knowing that you are heading in a good direction, you're doing this on purpose, then as well as that habituation part, and just like knowing that it doesn't bother you, or you can survive it,
you can cope.
You can cope, you can handle it. I think like the distress tolerance, for me, that's two things: the stress tolerance of the sensation of anxiety, but also like this might be me thinking of social anxiety stuff, but the distress tolerance of coping with the non-catastrophic negative outcomes. Right? So this is maybe more of a, because like if you're afraid of dogs, you're like, oh, I got bitten by a dog. It wasn't that bad. I mean, that's probably not what we're...
But panic attacks, right? You get to see...
Yeah, panic, definitely. Yeah,
experience this extreme physical discomfort, and it didn't kill me, or I didn't go crazy or whatever the prediction was. Like I could cope with it. It wasn't...
I think OCD too, like, well, this is kind of gross. It's kind of uncomfortable. I don't like it, but the cost isn't catastrophic.
Yeah.
And like in social anxiety, right? Getting a negative response from somebody, it's generally neutral, nice, being laughed at, it's short-lived, you know.
Even when I first talk about like a lot with GAD, like worry stuff, and we just will do a way of leaning into it of like, okay, what is the fear? What's the worst case scenario that it's predicting? Now let's say it actually happened, facing the fear. What would you do? How would you cope? How would you get through it? Those are always the questions I'm asking, because it is that piece of like, yeah, it sounds like it'd be awful. It sounds like it would really suck, but like, let's sit here a moment and beyond the just like, oh no, okay, let's say it happens. Now what is working on that like distress tolerance? Like if it happens, what next?
Yeah. Like, how would you tolerate this? What would you do? And like how bad exactly would it be? And I think doing the cognitive is useful, but on a feeling level, I think that actually facing it and going, well, that happened. I thought I'd feel terrible for a long time, but it was like not awful. Nothing super bad happened, and I kind of just felt bad for a bit of time, and then it went away. That feels really different, and that's, I think, especially in like social anxiety, because the exposures themselves are so short-lived. Versus like, I don't know, spider thing, you can sit and stare at it for 3 hours.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, whereas like a social exposure is quick. You know, it's probably over fairly quickly, unless it's like a big speech or something. But
yeah, or if you're like going to a party or a get together or a dinner and have to like be there for a while.
Yeah, so some of those can be longer, but a lot of them are these sort of short interactions with people, and if it goes badly, tends to not go badly for 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Tends to go badly and be over pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think that social cost kind of piece of it, like, oh, yeah, the person was like non-responsive, but they didn't yell.
Yeah.
There wasn't like some disgust. The whole crowd didn't turn and point and laugh. It wasn't that negative of an outcome. And the internal negatives of like, oh no, I'm going to feel this way. How long does that last? How bad is it?
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of your like favorite exposures that you have done with clients or that you have done with yourself? Have you used exposure? Because we as humans, right, all face fears.
Yeah, I mean, I try to do it regularly if I can. You know, like try to think of things and sort of push myself in certain ways. As you know, and then I mean, with other people as often as I can. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of I kind of like sort of the creative aspect of finding out what once you identified the fear and the feared outcome, how can we start to test this, and how can we start to face it in these little ways?
So you kind of seek it out.
Yeah, I think so.
For it.
Yeah.
Chase it so it can't chase you. I think I'm much more reactive when I notice like, oh, this thing that I wasn't previously scaring me or I didn't know.
Yeah.
You know, was anxiety or whatever. Oh, hey, phew, like there's something I can do about this. I'm thinking of like, obviously like shark phobia. I developed a fear of sharks way before I knew anything about psychology or exposure work. But so I've used a lot with that. With insomnia, like anxiety around sleep, like that developed. And it took me a while to realize like, oh, this is anxiety about sleep. There's something I can do about it. I have a new one.
Oh, yeah?
Developed in the past like year or so, 2 years. It kind of goes, it's like a morphed shark one. I have a fear lately of flying over water.
Oh, okay.
And we just went to Hawaii like last month. And I did have a lot of like, I'm going to be like flying over water for a long period of time. Which, right, when you start like engaging this, like if you're crashing over land, or if you're crashing over water, probably not a great outcome no matter what.
Equivalent.
Which is helpful, right? Starting to like some switch to it. Yeah. Gives me a little perspective. But yeah, I had to do, I mean, obviously I did it.
Yeah, this flights.
I knew it was gonna be okay. But definitely, yeah, it was a new one that I'm like, okay, well, new thing to work on facing.
Okay, so that was interesting, right? So that's the fear is the plane will crash and I'll be in water and then there'll be like sharks or creatures in there.
Or like drown, right? It's morphed from like sharks specifically to more just water and unknown things.
Yeah. So that's the fear, right? And then you did exposure of not getting in the water and seeing if creatures get you, but of flying over it. So this is one where if we were looking at, well, if the exposure worked for you, like if your distress came down over time or whatever, it's not because you're, I mean,
it's because the likelihood,
the
likelihood was low, not because the catastrophe was
totally doable. Yeah. So it's on the cognitive level. It's a likelihood shift. You're like, oh, okay, I've been flying for a long time. Nothing's happened. It feels less likely that it would happen. Not that you got in the water and this isn't so bad. We crashed. I'm in the water. I'm okay.
No biggie.
It probably would be pretty bad. And there are plenty of exposures, right?
Where you don't actually do the thing.
Yeah, we're designing stuff because we're like, well, some things legitimately are.
Yeah, like dying, right? Fears of I can't make you die.
Yeah.
We can do like, imaginal exposure toward it, but I can't actually like do an in vivo exposure. So imaginal
exposure is an interesting idea, yeah.
So just in the same way, like, well, all anxiety exists in your imagination, right? Because it's all predicted. Like, what if this happens? What if that happens?
And it's images in the head for the most part, right?
Yeah, it's not actually
in front of you at the time.
Happening. Yeah. Yes. So just in that like anxiety kind of exists in the imagination, you can face the fear in imagination. And so, yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways of doing it. But one I often do is I'll have somebody say a sentence or write a paragraph of like what the feared situation is, or, you know, even like, yeah, feared intrusive thought or what have you. And then we'll have them say it over and over or write it over and over, have the image of it, and face it, and have to them do it, you know, for a good amount of time, 5 minutes, like 5 minutes every day for a week or two.
Yeah, and that's sort of doing exposure of the thought or the feeling or the idea. And so it's not necessarily it didn't come true in real life. It's more like I was able to handle it. It didn't bother me. I sort of got used to it. I kind of got bored by it. Like that's one of the models of exposure, is this idea of...
it takes this idea that your brain kind of codes is super important, starts to reduce.
Yeah, it gets used to it. It gets bored of it. Like we sort of use that example of watching a horror movie 10 times. It's just it gives your brain a chance to get bored of the stimulus.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because I always talk with clients like, you know, there are tons of horrible thoughts or scary thoughts, but they are not occupying so much of your time because you haven't coded them as like, yes, super interesting. So it could be the thought of like, oh, I have no idea. Car tires are going to all blow out at the same time when I'm driving, right? That's a terrible thought, but that thought doesn't really like bother you a ton because your brain hasn't like coded it as important. Whereas this thought is super important and wants your attention all the time. And so
that's a very metacognitive approach, which I appreciate.
Exposure to the fact that starts to reduce how important and therefore how much attention grabbing it is.
That reminds me, I do sometimes instead of like a cognitive approach with the framing of an exposure, doing a metacognitive approach in the framing of things. Meaning like, what does this tell us about how important these thoughts are? Rather than like, is it true or not, to make you calm down, but in general, like, well, how important are these thoughts that you get from the anxious part of your brain? How seriously should we take them? Should you engage with it and think about it and analyze it and plan around it? Or have we seen it happen enough times in the past to know, oh, it's just this general kind of exaggerated part of you that's trying to protect you from stuff? So on a metacognitive level, like you can make that part of the exposure process.
Yeah, I do that all the time where I'm like, you know, the goal is to be able to, I'll kind of let thoughts go by, but this one's kind of gets stuck. So,
should we treat that one as being super important and super accurate? Is there some reason to think that, oh, this is the important thought, this is the one that really tells us what's going on? And doing the exposure can be a way of getting at that metacognitive belief.
Other ways you do exposures, right? Like panic attacks, I always do. Interoceptive exposures are kind of physiological.
Yeah, bringing on all the physiological feelings of anxiety as a way of kind of showing yourself, you don't pass out, you don't die, you survive. You can tolerate the feeling. The feeling's uncomfortable but not dangerous. Social anxiety, it's a lot of basically risking showing some kind of flawed piece of the self, and discovering how noticeable it is, how much people care, how critical they are, how rejecting they are, and whether you can tolerate that. I have a very complicated model that I will not get into today, but doing that kind of process. Or like fear of, you can do a lot of OCD exposures around like contamination or how dangerous a thought is.
Yes. Oh, yes. Right. Even I think like you can do like in vivo exposures for harm OCD, right? We do that all the time. Like I'll have a client like have a knife in our session or something like that. But you also can do, right, like a lot of imaginal exposure for that piece too. because there might not be some things that the hard thing is like sometimes with exposure, right? Like other people might not want to go along with the exposure, right? If they don't know much about exposure therapy. So it can be hard to do everything in vivo, like in real life. So unusual exposure can be super helpful for that. Like let's just in our head write a story, write a script. So this actually does come true.
Yeah. And like, and there's some stuff that you can't do real life exposures to just logistically.
Sure. Like flying, right? You might not be able to fly every single day. Totally.
You mean your own death at least?
Yes.
That'd be a hard sell.
That's hard.
Yeah.
Although I love doing some for death because I'm always like, okay, let's start with like the cognitive piece. Like, okay, the fear is like you die. And then I always pull up, I'm like, what would you do? And how would you cope? And how would you feel? And most of my clients like, well, not that I'm dead. I'm like, like, I guess like when it's more of like the building up to death than it is actually like being dead. I'm like, okay, good to know.
Yeah, there you go.
Start like teasing it apart.
Yeah.
Death, it's the like dying, not the like death part so much.
Totally. Yeah. The process or the what you're missing out on. Yeah. But there's I will say so exposure it's in the running for, if not the biggest discovery of clinical psychology, right? And therapy treatment. It is like a superstar in its ability to help people overcome anxiety disorders.
Yeah, I will say I think I actually like went into this field because I worked with doing like some domestic violence work and things before this, and that is making change is slow and there's a lot of backtracking, and it sometimes can feel like you're not really moving the marker much. Whereas I did a practicum at UT with Diana Damer, and seeing like, oh my gosh, like people can really improve significantly and not in fairly quickly.
Fairly quickly, yeah.
So encouraging, and just like made me feel like so excited to be part of the process. And
because it really works.
It works.
And it's the struggle, of course, is that it's scary. Very hard work, and it's scary, very scary for people to do. Like the outcome is worth it. If you're us and you've seen the outcome happen hundreds of times, the outcome's worth it, but it takes a lot of courage. It takes this belief, hope, and courage to do it. But the outcomes are really stunning, like on multiple levels. Like it changes lives. It's great.
I know. And I think that is the hard thing. I do think sometimes we as exposure therapists get a little habituated to the pain of exposure. Because I'm always like, well, let's do this. And I, then I'll have like a new client who's like, well, pump the brakes.
Yeah.
Like, that's terrifying.
I came to you to make me less anxious.
Yes. And so.
I mean, and again, that's why I think it's beneficial for us to do our own exposures whenever we can. Because it is very helpful in reminding, it's torture. That's right. It's torture that has a wonderful outcome. But it's torture.
Well, I may have already said this anecdote on this podcast before even, but I was at like an OCD conference a few years ago, right, where they had us write down like somebody you love or someone who's very dear to you, and then you had to write like, I hope they die like a horrific and painful death in the next week. And there were exposure therapists in this conference who wouldn't do it, which is that flabbergasting, right? Like,
I mean, except that on a human level, it makes total sense.
But not
on a psychologist level, it doesn't make sense. But on a human level, of course.
Obviously, like there was I had always, it felt awful, and then I forgot about it like the next day, and then I saw it was on my phone. It was like weeks, months later, I saw it was on my phone. I was like, oh geez, nobody finds the phone. Like, and that is also a big reason why with clients I try to work very collaboratively and do exposures, do the very thing with them.
Do it with them, that really helps. Like a lot of times I'll do it first, so they get there's a little bit of observational stuff, if it makes sense in the context.
Like the modeling, always like with interceptive exposures. I think that's a big one, right? To see like, to say like, yeah, my heart is racing right now too after we jogged in place for a minute, or I hate the one where you breathe through the cocktail straw. I hate it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So like doing that and saying like, yeah, this one's really tough for me. I really don't like it, and modeling that and doing that with people, I think is
So
like super helpful too.
I like to do the social ones. But I like to do it first as like a sort of observational learning before someone does it, which reminds me, I haven't put it out yet, but I did I did an exposure video for our YouTube channel, Thomas Miniman, PhD, YouTube
Mhm.
channel, where I got people to film me and I went around asking people really stupid questions.
Yes, like what?
Like, I was in New York City and there's this thing called the Oculus, which is this like big sort of famous thing. It's like World Trade Center thing. And I stood in front of that and asked people where the Oculus was. And
Classic.
then I like asked people, I stood out in front of a Starbucks and asked them where the nearest coffee shop was.
Mm,
And then I went into Starbucks and asked a ton of stupid questions
I
in
love it.
there. So I haven't put it out yet, but I will. I will soon. So, and I have a couple of other exposures, like social anxiety exposures, on the YouTube page of me like smiling at everyone and saying hi to everyone as they walk past me, and getting a whole host of reactions.
Yeah.
So, like, I love doing all this stuff. Yeah, because then
I would be curious about that exposure, like regionally, like different parts of the country.
yeah. So I did it in Sydney, um, and I did get a comment on there from somebody who said, "Try this in my area!" Exclamation point. I'm like, with the assumption of, oh, like people would not respond as nicely, which may be true, and I would try it in
Yes,
another area. I'd be
right?
totally
Test it
down to
out.
do that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
So like,
because
do not
maybe,
tolerate the discomfort of people,
well,
whatever.
what was funny to me is I was thinking of how unfriendly strangers were in Sydney compared to Texas. I go to Texas, everyone says hi to me. I don't even have to say hi to
Yes,
them.
you don't have to. Yes, I remember that moving from Boston to Austin. That like my
Yeah.
mother helped me move, and like somebody even just in a gas station stopped us and was like chatting with us, and she and I were like, what is this?
Yeah. So I'm like, I mean, maybe there's places that are less friendly than Sydney, but
Yes.
that seemed
Yeah.
to be the suggestion from that comment. But yeah, I'm gonna record just because I'm sort of in the mood to do this. I'm enjoying doing exposures, so I am going to probably do like a series of like social anxiety exposures on that
That's
page.
awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
If you want to record any videos of you doing exposures, I'll put those up too.
Okay. I don't do as much social anxiety.
No, it doesn't have to be social
A
anxiety. It can
ton
be
of,
any exposure you want
oh,
to do.
do my own.
Yeah, if you want to.
For the OCD Texas, the IOCDF, no, it was OCD Texas Awareness Week, like a couple weeks ago.
Uh-huh.
We like took pictures of us holding, doing different things. And I was holding, they were fake cockroaches. But guess who
Uh-huh.
kills cockroaches in our house now?
There you go, huh? Nice work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, I could take a picture of me like sleeping on the airplane from Hawaii as I was like habituating to the flight.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
hard thing is a lot of my fear is like water based, which isn't conducive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'd have to put you in murky water and take a video of it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, but okay, so we I think need to kind of wrap it up
Yeah.
around here. But what any sort of big takeaways or summaries for you of what people should remember according to you?
I mean, I think like, right, I think doing a graduated exposure is so helpful, right? Like,
Yeah.
I know you and I differ as to where we think a starting point is for people to do exposure. One of us is a
Uh-huh.
little nicer than the other.
Uh-huh.
I'm just always think of people's like actual willingness and follow through, and that you have to do it a whole bunch of times to get
Sure.
good habituation. So I think I usually have a smaller starting point than you. But yes, that like doable steps, right? Like take steps
Yeah.
towards it, and it doesn't have to be jumping into the deep end. Like any steps toward it counts.
Yeah. That makes sense. So just movement towards the thing that
Mhm.
makes you anxious. If you
Mhm.
keep doing that over time, it's going to get better
Yes.
rather
And a
than
good
worse.
exposure, yeah, is something that makes you anxious. It doesn't count if you're not anxious. That's not
Yeah.
exposed.
Yeah, you don't have to be
You don't
super,
have to be
super
terrified,
anxious,
but
but if your anxiety says don't do
throat.
this and you do it anyway, then that counts as an exposure.
Mm-hmm.
And can you sort of think of it like a point scoring system? Do it a bunch of times, small ones, a bunch of times. You can still get a lot of points that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, doable steps. How about yourself?
Yeah.
What's your
I mean, I
takeaway?
think my takeaway is, yeah, there's think about what that feared outcome is, and then as you move towards it, take note of like what actually happens and what that tells you about whether it's really dangerous or whether you really can't handle it. And these are ways of being skeptical of your anxiety, which will make your anxiety less powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And remembering, hey, this is hard work. It takes.
It's not how our brains are built. We are built to
Yeah.
avoid. We are built to
Yes.
run away to see another day, right? Like
Yeah.
this is so opposite of how we're built to giving
Yeah.
yourself some compassion and
So
kindness for even being willing to
compassion
do
and
it.
kindness for being willing to do it at all. It
Mm-hmm.
takes a lot of courage. Be very proud of yourself for doing it. And I'm reminded of like something that one of my people I worked with said at the end, which was like, I can't remember like the details. I wish I'd kind of written it down, but it was something along the lines of how facing your fears is like the most exhilarating and best part of life,
Mm-hmm.
which I like.
That.
I agree with,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like something that's really meaningful about doing it, even if it's in smaller ways over time.
Yes. I tell my daughter, bravery is not the absence of fear. It's doing things even when they're scary.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, thanks for checking us out.
Yeah, and I guess rate us and review us and subscribe and tell your friends and send us messages.
Yeah, keep them coming.
Yeah, you can be found somewhere.
Marianne at anxietyaustin.com.
And you can find me thomassmithyman.com, which is my name. The YouTube is Thomas Smithyman PhD YouTube page, I think. Do a search for that. And then if you want to email me, I'm just doctor, like dr, at thomassmithyman.com. And I have some small availability for people in Texas, New York, or internationally who want to do some treatment and are potentially interested in exposure therapy.
Yes, I'm only licensed in Texas, so can only take you Longhorns. Yeah,
but from what I understand, you have no room anyway.
You're
just a
it's
busy...
an anxious time. It's an anxious time. Well, thanks for checking us out, and yeah, we'll have another great topic next time.
Yeah. Okay.
See you later.
Bye-bye.